Morning. So I'm Andrew Kreighbaum. I'm a reporter at Bloomberg Law, where I cover employment-based immigration, including temporary work visas like the H-2A program, which we'll be discussing a bit today. And I'm joined by Cathy Burns from the International Fresh Produce Association, which represents companies across the fresh produce and floral supply chain. How are you, Cathy?
I'm doing great. How are you?
Great. So the U.S. is the world's largest exporter of food, but as we just heard, the biggest theme, especially in my beat, that you hear in conversations with folks in the sector is we just don't have enough workers to harvest that food. To start a little broadly, where have all these workers gone, and what's the connection to our immigration policies?
Yeah, it's a good question. And first of all, thank you to the National Immigration Forum for having me and for all the work that you do. I should probably check with the audience first. How many people like fruits and vegetables in this room? Okay, great. How many people would like to continue eating fruits and vegetables in this room? Exactly. So there you go. Here's the burning platform right here. And I think as we look, Janae just mentioned it, the difficulty that our sector has in getting agricultural workers, year-round agricultural workers, to ultimately pick fruits and vegetables around the whole, 50 states, all 50 states in some ways are touching the fruit and vegetable industry. And so what's happening is a couple things to answer your question. One is the H-2A program as it stands today is incredibly inefficient. It's difficult, it's costly, it's broken. Call it whatever you want. It's incredibly onerous on the companies that are trying to leverage it in their sector. That's one challenge. The second challenge is, guess what? Americans don't want to do these jobs. How many of you that have children or nieces or nephews or uncles or graduated with someone that said, I want to go work in a field? I don't see any hands raised. And this work is difficult. It's in tough locations. It's difficult work. It's hard. When you're in the production facilities, it's cold. And so as you think about the next generation, quite frankly, even today, the workers that we need to ultimately harvest, pick, distribute, travel, our products, that's just not jobs Americans want to do. And so the pipeline for today and into the future is just not there. And lastly, I would say the competition for workers. Would I rather work in a cold processing facility or a field where the sun is beating down on me 8 hours a day? Or would I rather work in a conducive office environment or someplace that is just not as difficult? So the competition is really tough for these workers. And so, I know there's a lot of change happening in the tech space right now. I highly doubt that the tech workers that are getting laid off right now are going to come work in agriculture.
No, I don't imagine so. You mentioned the H-2A program. I'm sure most folks in the room know it allows farmers to bring in foreign workers for temporary and seasonal work. And those visas are in higher demand than ever, to the tune of 213,000 issued in 2020, which was double the number from 5 years before that. Right. But I saw this week Representative Dan Newhouse had a tweet. He said, our food supply is under threat because the program is so out of date. You mentioned it's really onerous for farmers. So why is the program so insufficient despite the demand, despite the record number of visas being issued? What are the problems you hear about from your members?
Yeah, so 73% of agriculture workers are foreign. And if you think about contextually what our industry means to the food supply chain, the output or the GDP of food and ag is $1 trillion. The fruit and vegetable industry employs 2.2 million workers. 2.2 million workers. And of that $1 trillion, almost $340 billion is in the fruit and vegetable industry. So as we think about the importance of having, a steady supply of agricultural workers, a few things come to mind, of which the Farm Workforce Act would help tremendously in. First of all, it allows for year-round workers. How many people like mushrooms? Mushrooms are harvested year-round. And the mushroom industry does not have the capability of leveraging the H-2A program. So the Workforce Act addresses that. It certainly addresses earned legalized status for agriculture workers that are already harvesting our fruits and vegetables and providing products to the consumer. So that's an important consideration. Capped wages, so ultimately there's more predictability for people that own the farms. I mean, can you imagine running an organization, some of you probably do, where over 50% of your expenses are labor, but you don't know what those expenses are going to look like 5 years down the road? How do you run a business like that? And so the opportunity to have more predictability in the supply chain, this act will actually address. And that's critically important as you think about, if I'm, I was talking to a farmer a couple weeks ago in Florida. He actually grew strawberries. Probably for Driscoll's. And I said, "Oh, Carl, it's so great to see you. What are your biggest challenges?" And he's like, "Well, I don't have as many challenges these days." I'm like, "Really?" I said, "Last I talked to you, labor was a huge challenge." He's like, "It was such a huge challenge that my farm is now concrete." He sold his farm. He sold his farm. He's a third-generation farmer. So what did he do? He saved 150 acres for his son so that he could still have, the legacy of his farm to be able to grow strawberries, but not at the size and scale, and certainly that's not going to be an income his son can live off. But can you imagine being 30 years old, being a son of a farmer, thinking that I'm the next generation and not knowing what 50% of my expenses are going to look like? And where am I even going to get the labor to be able to support that? The average age of a person harvesting our fruits and vegetables are in their 60s. God love them that they do this work. Honest to God, if you haven't gone out and kicked dirt, which, by the way, I think every American should go out and kick some dirt and see actually where their food comes from. I think our kids think it magically shows up at a supermarket and then on their plates or in a restaurant. It is hard, hard work. So that's the opportunity, I think, that this particular act addresses fundamentally. Housing. $1 billion of the Reform Act would be invested in housing. It's about having just good housing that really meet the standards of local laws in a particular community of where product is grown and harvested. I mean, this isn't about putting them in a Four Seasons. Mm-hmm. This is about making sure that they have adequate housing so that they can ultimately do the work. So there's a lot of components that would really fix a broken system so that we have year-round availability of product, that people are in great housing situations, that we have capped wages so ultimately people have more predictability and that we have earned legal status. Those are four, Andrew, that come to mind when you ask that question.
When you make the case for this legislation, I imagine you talk a lot about what this means on the consumer side. How do these labor shortages, the uncertainty that farmers face, translate to the prices folks are paying at the grocery store?
Yeah, I mean, hands down, number one concern of the consumer right now is inflation. In fact, those of you who will be shopping for your Thanksgiving meal next week, if you haven't already, you're going to pay 20% higher than you paid last year for your Thanksgiving meal. So this issue is not going away, and one we've actually leveraged as we start to talk about members of the House to ultimately introduce a bill that gets consideration in the next 5 legislative working weeks. So what's really great and why the conversation is a little different this time than the last 36 years is that we actually have data to show that by modernizing an H-2A program, a study was released out of Texas A&M that I invite you to get your hands on, that actually shows that by modernizing the H-2A program, bringing in more migrant workers, you actually lower inflation. Here's the other secret. American wages actually go up. We are not displacing American workers. We're not lowering American wages because we're bringing in migrant workers. Why? Why do American wages go up? Because we have more predictability. And we're able to grow the product that we can actually sell, maybe even stretch ourselves a little more, because here's what's happening. Farmers are only growing what they can pick. So it's a simple supply and demand equation. If you can only grow what you can harvest, then obviously there's going to be a gap between demand and supply. What happens when there's a gap between demand and supply? You're going to pay more. We are going to pay more. And that's exactly what's happening, is that we don't have predictability of the labor force, or worse yet, it's leading to food waste. $600 billion here in the United States is wasted every year during harvest or just past harvest. Everyone talks about the waste that happens in supermarkets or in food establishments, or what we're wasting in our own refrigerator. $600 billion worth of fruits and vegetables are being wasted on the farm. Why? Because we don't have the labor to be able to pick it. So those farmers and organizations that might get a little more aggressive in planting because they're hoping they'll have labor, if you don't have the labor, it's going to rot on a tree, it's going to fall to the ground, then it gets plowed over, then you see the pictures of food waste all over the place. So in the United States, we don't have a production problem. We do not have a production problem for fruits and vegetables. We have a labor problem because we can't harvest it, we can't pack it, we can't process it, we can't ship it. And isn't it sad in a country where we have produce, fruits and vegetables access issues when we have produce excess? We have produce access issues, yet we have produce excess. And that should not happen in America. Yet here we are faced with it because we can't get enough workers to be able to let the marketplace work the way it should work. And the government's getting in the way of that.
You know, we were talking before this session about the fly-in you had for IFP members this week who are making the case for this bill on the Hill. Could you talk about what you see? You know, we've got this brief window to get something done in the lame duck potentially before the next Congress. What are the biggest obstacles to getting a bill out of the Senate? The Farm Worker Modernization Act passed the House last year with, I believe, bigger Republican votes. So how do you get a bill done in the Senate? And in particular, how do you get the GOP votes you need?
Well, and we heard it earlier. I mean, every member has constituents in their area that are in the agriculture sector somewhere. I mean, I'm talking a lot about fruits and vegetables, but dairy is also a huge issue that needs this bill passed as well in order to be able to qualify for workers to be able to supply dairy products to Americans as well. So obviously, I'm advocating for and focusing on fruits and vegetables, but my brothers and sisters around the food chain certainly have the same passion and energy and drive to make this happen. So certainly the opportunity to make it happen now is, again, as I just said, inflation. I mean, one, constituents have representatives in their states that are having the same challenges, again, across the U.S. There are organizations, farmers, that never, ever, ever use the H-2A program. Why? Because it was costly, because it was inefficient, because it was onerous. I mean, I can keep going on in terms of the challenges, but now all of a sudden, because Americans are defecting from those jobs, don't want to do those jobs, Americans want to own the farms, they don't want to work the farms. So now all of a sudden, the farmers, organizations that never used H-2A are now using H-2A programs. So regardless of where you sit in the United States, I would argue that every single state is somehow leveraging an H-2A program. And that's becoming, and so therefore I think that's a different conversation, whereas opposed to, oh, that's just a California thing, or that's just a Washington thing, or that's just a Michigan thing. Oh, no, 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 it's a North Carolina thing, and a Florida thing, and pick a state. People are leveraging these workers, which is why visas are going up, because American workers are defecting from those jobs. So that's one talking point that I think opens up a different conversation. The second is around inflation. I can't imagine there's a members of Congress that's saying, oh yeah, inflation's great, let's go higher. You know, I mean, they're hearing it. It's the number one consumer concern, I don't care what state you live in. So here we have an opportunity and data to show that if we modernize the H-2A program in the workforce, you're actually going to lower inflation. Is it a silver bullet? Absolutely not. Does every little bit help? Absolutely. And so those are a couple ways that I think the conversation can be a little bit different this time. And it's lame duck. You know, if the Democrats want to win and the Republicans don't want to deal with it, let's do it. You know, we have the perfect setup to get it through, especially on the agricultural space, to make that happen.
We're about a week out from the midterms. Republicans look like they're going to narrowly retake the House. How does that change the calculus for you? Yeah,
makes it more difficult. It just got more complex. And again, we heard it in the panel right before we came on, is it's going to be really, really challenging. And, you know, leaders have already said, you know, we don't want to deal with immigration because of border security, and, you know, it's the same conversation that we've been hearing for 36 years now. And so I think it will definitely become more challenging, which is why we're all here right now, right, to really try to leverage these next 5 weeks in the lame duck to get it through. Now, that means if it doesn't happen in the lame duck, that doesn't mean we're going to stop. You know, we're going to continue to have the conversation, we're going to continue to be aggressive, but I think we have a really unique moment in time, and the time is now, that we need to make something happen. And so why we're all here, and the voice of the people that are impacted the most to their representative is so critical right now.
Just briefly, Cathy, there's been a few attempts over the last couple of decades to pass a modernization bill. If we don't get something done in the next 5 weeks, a year, where are we going to be in the in the short term in terms of the agricultural production in the U.S.?
Yeah, Andrew, it's a short-term and a long-term issue, no question. I mean, you're going to have farmers like Carl that are going to say, you know what? It's a lot easier to turn my land into concrete. And this country was built on the shoulders of agriculture. I mean, our forefathers are turning in their graves right now, watching what's happening to this industry. So in the short term, you're going to continue to see inflation, high inflation. Worst it's been in 40 years. And if we don't dramatically change the input costs, of which the number one input cost is labor, we're going to continue to see high inflation. You're already hearing it for the first and second quarter of 2023. Not a lot of relief coming, especially in the food space. So in the short term, we'll continue to see high inflation. In the mid to long term, you're going to see people saying, you know what, I'm out. I'll sell my land. You will see technology. You will continue to see investments in technology. We're seeing that now. You see it with vertical farming. You see it with controlled environment agriculture. You see it with applications on the field grown products as well that are going to make us better and more efficient. But that takes a lot of capital investment. Capital's not just flowing around these days. So, we're struggling to pay for workers. Imagine what it costs to invest in capital in your farm. That's obviously amortized over a number of years, but you need to at least get a chunk of cash in the beginning to be able to leverage technology. And that's happening, and that will continue to happen. But it's not going to happen in the short term. That's a longer term play. So you're definitely going to see continued pressure on the system, continued increase in costs. You're going to see farms being plowed under or sold. And guess what? We're going to see more imports. You know, you mentioned earlier that, you know, America is one of the largest export communities. Well, we're going to be the largest import communities if thing doesn't change as well. And again, what a shame. It's not about production. We have enough product in the U.S. to deal with our access issues. And I should also say the other issue is the health of this nation is at risk. 1 in 10 Americans are actually eating the correct number of fruits and vegetables. 1 in 10. There are more people walking around metabolically sick than healthy in the U.S. $1.4 trillion in diet-related diseases. $1.4 trillion in diet-related diseases, all of which can be addressed by what's on the end of your fork. And we're putting all of that at risk by not having the workforce that we need in order to set us up for review. That's the long term. The long term is we're going to have the next generation of people behind us. If we don't change the trajectory, we'll be the first generation that won't live as long as their parents did. And I don't know about you, I don't want that happening under my watch, which is why this topic is so important.
I think that's all we've got time for, but thanks for joining us, Cathy, and thanks to the audience for the interest.